Thank you very much, Randall, and a good afternoon to all ladies and gentlemen. Now, data from the Climate Policy Initiative said that average climate finance was about 1.3 trillion US dollars in the period of 2021-2022. And that was double what it was the period before. Now, we saw from the beautiful video at the beginning that we need much more for that, for climate action. And I get to say that it's beautiful because I had no hand in the video, so it's not self-promotion. So countries and corporates alike seek to close this financing gap. And legal practitioners play a constructive role in this battle or in this search for climate action. Because the truth of the matter is where investments go, legal documentation follows. So I'm going to try this exercise out. Can I have a show of hands for the members of the audience who are legal practitioners or have a legal background? Okay, so bear with me, I'm trying my luck here. How many of you are from corporates, whether you're a project developer, you're an investor, just less legal background? So we're in good company. We have different perspectives, different insights for this panel, and I think that will make for a very exciting one. So a gentle reminder, please do submit all your Q&As on the QR code behind your name badge, and I think you can also find the QR code on the screen in a little bit. Now, Peter, you're the General Counsel of Lightrock. So has there been an observed increase in the requirements that your limited partners have asked for in terms of ESG and impact principles? And I'm quite conscious that GenZero is a limited partner in Lightrock. So please be gentle.
I will. Well, thank you first for inviting me. It's great to be here and be part of the wider buzz. It's great to have some positivity around this topic. So LP requirements. So I think you can guess what the answer is. Yes, higher expectations, more defined requirements, but are those making it into the fund documents that we're dealing with is another topic in itself. So first of all, I should explain a bit of background which will give some light to or enlighten the answer. We at Lightrock mainly have Luxembourg funds. We have a climate impact fund, which is why I'm sitting here. And as you may know, if you know anything about Luxembourg funds or deal with Luxembourg funds, they're EU, and so they're subject to the Sustainable Finance Directive regulations. And so at Lightrock we have Article 9 funds, which are dark green funds, and so they have quite high reporting requirements. So we're driven to having to comply with those regulations, but with our investors and with ourselves and with our portfolio companies, we're all on the same team in this topic. So our investors include Article 9 investors who have to comply with the regulations themselves. We must comply, we want to comply of course, and our portfolio companies are all in the impact space, creating positive impact for the planet, including GHG reduction of emissions. And so we're all in the same space. So those, as I mentioned before, those requirements that investors have are mainly still in side letters, but as an Article 9 investor, you're right, as an Article 9 investor, our fund documents start at a higher threshold in any case. So there's less content flowing into side letters than there used to be before Article 9 was implemented.
I have a question for you on side letters, Peter, but I will put a pin in that for a bit later on once we're a bit warmed up. Now, Suze, Jeroen, have you seen similar trends in your practice in the UK and in the US and in Europe? Are LPs putting pressure on GPs to include these types of provisions, more ask, more excluded investments, more reporting requirements into these documents? And Peter, I move the question to Jeroen and Sue, so I'm not forcing you to lead anything on.
Well, I'll start by talking about the US, and I'll actually tie it to the last panel. I think what is really interesting for lawyers in this space is that investors and companies have gone much further on climate and sustainability generally than the law requires, right? So I would say it's kind of, I'm from San Francisco, a lot of talk about AI. It's very similar to AI. Law and regulation is lagging years behind technology. The same thing is true in sustainability and climate. And so when you think about what the pressures are, LP pressure is one, regulatory pressure somewhat now, but really what has been driving it is larger institutional investors who have realized, in fact, their returns are more based on GDP of a country than an individual company's alpha, the sort of portfolio theory. And so they have to, as custodians of funds for teachers, for firefighters particularly, they need to be putting pressure on the GPs to really think about both emissions and climate risk, kind of the two different frameworks. And I'll talk a little later. One of the interesting things that has happened, Europe, Asia, and the US, is there's been a lot of innovation within the fund structures to try to align sort of the LP's interest with the GP. Things like tying carry to climate, which has been around about 15 years, but has become much more common, like the terms of funds, like your CEO was talking about having, I hate the term blended finance because I don't think it works over the last 50 years, but what we call stacking the deck, where you use first loss capital, where you have nonprofits and GPs screening deals, or where you have alternatives to funds like permanent capital vehicles that are really taking off. And all of this allows lawyers to be really creative. There's sort of a framework around aggregation of capital, and we're playing with all of the different elements. And partially it's LPs, but partially it's because if you have a thesis around reducing emissions, around having an impact in climate, as a private pool of capital, you want to actually make sure that what you're doing, your investor, your portfolio companies do that. Jeroen, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, thank you first of all to GenZero for inviting me here, and Randall, I don't know where you are, but thank you very much for pronouncing my surname right. That doesn't often happen, so well done. Thank you very much for being here. Look, I am not a funds structuring lawyer or the one who sets together the documentation. I'm a litigator by background, but I did check with our funds teams, and they told me that they do see more investor sort of pressures in that sense. They see more excuse rights in the legal documentation. They see more side letters, and the excuse rights are becoming more granular. So, and as Peter says, how that then finds its way into fund documentation, particularly on open-ended funds, is the next question. But certainly on closed-end funds, there is more investor sort of pressure or granularity. And even in you mentioned Article 9 funds in Europe, even on Article 9 funds, which are dark green by nature, should be, even there we see more granularity in the documentation happening. So it's a short answer, I hope.
So let's pivot a bit to the more corporate element of conversations. Now, Kim, you are the head of investments at GenZero. So what are some of the key levers that you or we use as a double bottom line investor to achieve climate impact and yet achieve financial return? Because the reality is that we all have stakeholders, and there must be some financial incentive to make this work.
Right. I think one lever we have is to make life difficult for our GPs, but besides that, I think at GenZero we're also big direct investors, right? So I'm going to talk from that perspective. And I think if you think about the types of investments that we do, actually the levers that we have are actually quite different, right? Because I think the problems that we're trying to solve are also quite different. So I think starting first with technology-based investments, I think here, and I think before we even go into transaction documentation, we should talk about due diligence, because ultimately the findings of due diligence are what informs a lot of what we put in place into transaction documents to actually make the sort of legal frameworks that we enter into work for us. So I think as a double bottom line investor, we care very much about direct climate impact, and we care very much therefore that companies measure their climate impact and actually also tell us about it. Right, and so I think before any investment is made, there is a very robust ESG assessment that takes place, and the resultant gaps are what we then choose to, then what we look to solve for in the documentation. Whether you enshrine it as, condition subsequent or whatever you will, right? There needs to be a sort of mechanism that will allow us to actually engage with the portfolio company in the future on these issues that are critical when we think about impact, whether it's direct climate impact or, other social measures, right? And of course, the usual sort of transaction levers around reserve matters, information rights, voting rights, all of that kicks in for the traditional sort of technology or carbon market enabler type investment that we make. I think perhaps more interesting to talk about the nature investments that we make, because that's where it all gets a little bit hairy, unfortunately. Putting aside the whole legal nature of voluntary carbon credits aside, I think the issue with such investments is that they are fairly risky, right? Very often you're working with developers that may not be quite as established because it's a relatively new space. So you're taking physical risk, you're taking a lot of risk. And you're also doing this for a very long amount of time, right? So it's infrastructure effectively, because it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So how do you actually put in place mechanisms that will actually protect you from a return standpoint, while also making sure that the projects that you invest in are permanent, right? So I think things that we do, and you could be structuring this as an investment into an SPV, right? Or you could be structuring this as a contractual agreement or a streaming agreement. Right? And there will be different characteristics, right? But I think ultimately when we think about ensuring the sort of longevity of a project that we invest into, which is critical for the permanence of the impact that we make, we think about putting in place things like sinking funds, right? To say that, every year a certain percentage of profits have to go towards subsequent remediation, right? If there is a sort of any shortfall in terms of the impact that we thought we could bring and the credits that could be issued from a certain project. We could put in place escalations, right? The more profits are made from a project, the higher the sort of benefit sharing that accrues to local communities. And I think then, bringing it back to my original point on due diligence, so much of it for nature is very different, right? It's about, FPIC, which, I always free, prior, informed consent, right, of the local communities that are impacted by these projects. What are the results of that FPIC analysis, and how do you then actually take what you learn from that and put it in place into the document that you are signing up to actually enshrine a lot of the rights that you want to make sure are protected for the local communities. So, and over the course of 20, 30 years, so much can happen, and your transaction document needs to be thinking through a lot of these issues. Yes, I will stop because I've rambled for quite a while.
Thanks, Kim. And I think that's particularly interesting because there's quite a distinction between how we think about nature-based investments versus what maybe some of us may be more familiar in the legal practice for later stage investments where you've got full-blown reps and warranties that you are very sure you can get claims from. So that is quite a unique difference in that way. Now, Peter, you also have this unique position of getting to have that conversation with LPs, but also having that conversation with portfolio companies. So do you also then negotiate these similar rights, obligations, reporting frameworks with your portfolio companies? And how do you ensure that Lightrock then fulfills its obligations to its LPs while supporting PopCos, which may be earlier on, may have less infrastructure in place to actually undertake all these things?
Yeah, so I should start by saying we're a growth investor. So very rarely we invest in early stage companies. So often we don't see that issue. So we're investing in established companies. But the process starts as soon as the company's identified as a potential great fit for the climate fund. And so we have an impact team of 7 out of 105 employees or so quite chunky, including one of my lawyers who changed sides. and so that dialogue with the company starts immediately. And again, we're all on the same team. So these are the companies that are trying to do good with their technology to have positive climate impact or GHG reduction. And so they've already bought into what we're trying to do. So that commonality is really good for creating that whole team approach. And so when we come to them, we start off by, after we've done proper due diligence, start off by identifying the KPIs that are relevant to their business. So, and depending on if their technology is biomass or whatever it is, we'll have identified KPIs out of our smorgasbord of 40. And so we agree those with the company, and we also agree, as you can guess probably, if we've identified in due diligence any areas for improvement, we'll have a corrective action plan agreed with them. We'll have a value creation plan agreed with them, which is heavily impact orientated. And yeah, the full smorgasbord of options with engagement. On the reporting, we have two ends. You know, we want to be able to measure that impact that the company's having for ourselves and for what we do, not just for the regulatory obligation that we have. And so with that regulatory reporting and the KPI reporting, LPs sometimes have their own reporting requirements, be they Article 9 or not. And so they might want quarterly reports. We're getting quarterly reports, so instead of the annual impact report that we have for investors, we'll agree to give quarterly reporting on certain key KPIs to particular LPs.
Thanks, Peter. And one of the Q&A questions just came in and preempted the question anyway. So, you know, we've talked about how, and Jeroen has also talked about it, how a lot of these rights get negotiated into the side letter. And is it the time for these provisions now to be included in the main transaction documents instead? To, you know, make that note in your limited partnership agreement to say, hey, these are my excluded investments. They are a long list, but I'm a climate impact fund, and I'm committed to do this. What are your thoughts on that?
Was that a question to Peter or to me or to?
Peter, but also
sorry,
to
sorry,
you.
You guys, sorry. You were looking my way, so I didn't know.
So again, we've got to look at our entire family of LPs. And so I come back to the team thing, because they're investing in a climate impact fund because they want to see impact and positive benefit. So because of that, you know, I think I mentioned before, Louisa, that we start off with, you know, rather than basic fund documents, we start off at a higher level so that a lot of those concerns that would have been in the side letter are in the fund documents for a start.
And if I could just respond also, what we're seeing exactly that. You have obviously individual LPs at the fund level that need to have certain rights and certain reporting, but for those funds that are focused on climate, that are focused on impact, a lot of it is much more embedded. And in fact, those same KPIs, the LPs have started to say, those are the KPIs that should determine whether or not you get all or a portion of the carry in connection with the fund, so it links. And if you think about sort of the lawyering that is happening in this space, it is the lawyering around the scaffolding around the funds themselves and alternatives. It is the deployment of capital, and I would say we're focused on kind of the easy stuff, which is the getting the information and then reporting and setting the KPIs. One thing I did want to note that has shifted in the last couple years in a really positive way is impact investors are starting to be able to benchmark. There's an organization called the Data Convergence Initiative, where most of the growth equity and private equity investors are voluntarily providing the data. So when one of Peter's portfolio companies says, you know, my emissions are 100, and that's, you know, that's good. We have good data, but is 100 good or bad for, you know, whatever you're doing? And there hasn't been the ability to do that benchmarking, and that is coming. But the scaffolding around the actual debt and equity instruments, again, your CEO talked about SDG, performance-linked bonds. There's a lot of innovation on the debt side. There's also a lot of innovation on the equity side beyond just reporting that is built into the documents in terms of governance rights, in terms of economic rights, that are creating the same incentives. Again, there's a whole range of those options depending on whether you're early stage, late stage, depending on your co-investors. And then, maybe I'll get to in a second, the underlying corporate form as well is shifting for the portfolio companies. That's really the governance and scaffolding around the entities. And it's not just avoiding greenwashing, and people are like, oh, that's great, you're not greenwashing. It's really ensuring that we get out of this mode where you operate, you make your money, and you give a little money away on the side. Philanthropic capital is less than 1/4% of the capital market. So having a model with a fund where you have a little bit of profits from the carry going to a nonprofit, or having a model as a company where you're pledging 1% is completely meaningless, and it's actually what's killing our planet. So there's not enough philanthropic capital, even with all of that, to make any real difference. And so you have to look at the corpus, the operations of the entity itself. And again, what lawyers have been doing, and we've been playing with and iterating now for 25 years, is how you build that into the framework and then have accountability for the asset managers back up to the LP level.
So Suze, I wanted to double click on that point. We've got a question from the audience. So it says investments in this space are long term. How would that impact the standard, So the point was, how do we tie this in, you know? Are there certain mechanisms, are there certain types of mission-focused provisions that we then build in to these legal documentation?
Well, the long range nature of a lot of these investments is why there has been a movement from sort of the GP-LP structure for asset manager to permanent capital vehicles. I mean, or to evergreen funds, to alternatives at the company level to enable there to be mission long-term that survives M&A is something we've also been playing with for quite a while. And what we're seeing is a rise of what we put in place for Patagonia, which is the Perpetual Purpose Trust. We're seeing a lot of golden shares. We're seeing a lot of hybrids between nonprofits and for-profits in the US and in Europe that allow for, again, us to get out of this kind of dichotomy of doing business and giving it away, to actually having much more of the mainstream business, but actually creating mission lock. And then there is, in the US here, I noticed that the coffee is a B Corp. B Corp is a certification, which is good, but it is not more than that. You self-report in. There are underlying corporate forms in the US that are needed in the US, not needed as much in Europe or Asia, that allow for dual fiduciary duties. And then if you have somebody that has a right to ensure that there's not conversion of those entities, they've been used to date by companies that are sort of in the sustainable impact world. They are designed to be used by fossil fuel, and they are designed to be used by dirty companies that need protection and insulation from liability when they engage in transition and their stock price drops. They haven't been used for that yet, but they have been designed for purpose.
Thanks, Suze. And I think another hot topic in recent times is climate litigation. We've seen that last week. Some of us might have been in the room. Headlines that says Swiss grandmas wins a positive outcome from the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, there are many other media articles that had very catchy headlines. So Jeroen, you are a litigator by practice, and you've shared that with us. Can you give us a brief overview of how climate litigation is right now?
Well, thank you, Louisa. Yes, the Swiss grandmas, I think the formal name is the Klimaseniorinnen in German. That was a case in front of the European Court of Human Rights, a climate litigation case, against the state, in this case against the Swiss government. You've also got the South Korean babies, so it's not just grandmas, it's also the young generation. You also had a case which was brought by Portuguese students, which was not admitted. It was an admissibility issue because for various technical reasons. So the one case which stood was the Swiss case. And the important part is there that under the European Convention of Human Rights, climate change is now really identified as a human rights issue. Now, I'm Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands. For us, that was not new at all, because we had a case back in 2019 or 2020 where the same was held at a national level, where there was a Supreme Court case by an NGO called Agenda, which said that the Dutch state should reduce its emissions by X% because it was a human rights issue. So that is not in itself new. What is relevant is that a lot of this climate litigation is indeed against states. And the big question is, to what extent are companies affected by it? So maybe on litigation more generally, we can look at it in two ways. First of all, is there a lot of litigation going on in the fund space as such, between GPs and LPs, etc.? That is not the case, at least not what we're seeing, for obvious reasons, because of the ecosystem of recurring relations, etc. So you wouldn't see as much of that. And I already mentioned in the context of documentation, you see more excuse rights and reserve matters and more granular documentation. So it's more that's the way it's more done. You do see quite a lot of screening of funds, when they, particularly retail funds, what are they saying about, what are they doing in respect of ESG screening or not? And that actually works both ways. So you can be sort of being between a rock and a hard place, or bitten by the cat and the dog, whatever way you want to express it. But you say you're doing ESG screening, are you doing enough, or are you then greenwashing that term? On the other hand, if you say you don't really do ESG screening, particularly in the US where you've got the red state, blue state debate, you say, well, I actually don't want to touch that, even if I call it differently. Sometimes it's a matter of labeling. But then, there's been cases against well-known investors by state attorney generals saying, well, you say you don't screen on ESG, but you are. And there's one case where, in my understanding, what the investor was actually doing is just checking for whether there was any modern slavery in the investment, and then that's ESG screening. So you have to be quite careful. So it works both ways. Also quite relevant and is that the SEC, and I'll get to climate litigation in a minute. I'm just going at the investor level. I mean, the SEC in the US has a climate task force, and they've got 100 people who are just working on enforcement against sort of funds to sort of see whether they are greenwashing, whether they are living up to what they're saying, whether they are or not doing ESG screening. But it's not just the SEC. You've got in Germany, you've got BaFin, you've got in Australia the regulator, you have the European Securities and Markets Association coming out with guidelines. So there's a lot of scrutiny from that side. Now going to, but the other elements, so this is at the investor level and GP, LP. But if we look at portfolio companies, I think that's where it becomes particularly interesting. So portfolio companies, the companies you invest in, can be obviously subject to greenwashing claims, or the alternative, you're now green hushing. You are understating your ambitions because you don't want to be caught out. So that's also a concern. But I think indeed that's greenwashing. But climate litigation is another one. And that's where your question went, and where I said a lot of the climate litigation is against states, but are companies affected? And some of you may have heard about the case against Shell in the Netherlands. That is an appeal which is going on, and I'll take a little bit of a rain check in the sense that we were acting for Shell on that case. But that appeal is after, in first instance, the court in the Netherlands, which is quite, if I can call it that, progressive by way of a judgment, has said that Shell had to reduce its emissions by 45% in 2030 compared to 2019.
Jeroen, you were talking about Shell and how it's a significant reduction.
Yeah.
As a corporate, with all these taxonomies in place, with the alphabet soup, I confess that gets bungled in my head in the EU, with the ESRS, the CSDDD. There are a lot of mandatory and some voluntary disclosure requirements now, right? And there's a lot of push for being front runners in this space. But with examples like the Shell case, how do corporates then find that balance between, being a front runner, showing I'm doing more than I need to, but at the same time not exposing themselves to litigation risk?
Well, that's a very good question, Lucia, and one I get often. And you're right, there's so many acronyms here. I was indeed trying to avoid them. In particular, I saw quite a large contingent in this space of non-lawyers, so I apologize for all the existing acronyms. There are many in Europe, many reporting, but a lot of it is around reporting standards, as you say, Louisa. There is no obligation as yet in European laws or other laws, as far as I'm aware, to actually reduce emissions by X%. That doesn't exist. Why Shell was so special is the court there, on the basis of an open duty of care norm standard, said that Shell did have that obligation. Now, whether that will remain or not, we'll see. But you're right. I mean, companies often ask that question of me as well. I want to do the right thing. I want to be a front runner, but then I get bitten for being a front runner. And Shell, for example, has been very transparent on its Scope 3 disclosures, Scope 3 emissions disclosures, and that then has, in a way, come back to bite it. Because Scope 3 emissions don't look great, right? If you're an energy company or an oil and gas major, I think they prefer to be called an energy company. But your scope 3 emissions are going to be pretty big. That's your business. And scope 3 emissions, by the way, I know everyone will notice probably, but are your customer emissions. So if I fly from Amsterdam to Singapore on KLM, the emissions connected with the aviation fuel is calculated as emissions of Shell, but they're not Shell's emissions, they are reported by them. And they were very transparent in reporting, and that then has had a bit of a backlash. So you're right, companies trying to be front runners sometimes are being held back because of this, and that also goes to the greenwashing and green hushing point that I mentioned earlier. So there is that dynamic, definitely. But I think to finalize the point on climate litigation, I think it is really going to be interesting to see whether this remains, this obligation to reduce on individual companies. But it has changed the behavior, and I think that's an interesting point. So if I look at it from the NGO's point of view, in this case, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, they've certainly been very effective, because with this judgment, many companies are thinking, oh, I may be next. Whether the judgment stands or not, they're definitely impacting behaviors quite big time. And the NGOs in the Netherlands, Friends of the Earth, wrote to 29 companies saying, basically, you're next. And I think that has a huge impact. And so I know we're here also to talk about how can we speed up decarbonisation and fight climate change. They've certainly been effective in that sense because of the wider effect of these type of judgments. Maybe I should stop there.
And if I could just add in answering the question for companies, US, European, Asian, international, really making sure you have good data, making sure that whatever you're saying, not letting your marketing department run amok. Like you actually know what people are saying. The number of people who said they're going to be net zero without understanding, not a single company can get to net zero by 2030, to be clear. And so before you make statements, everything that you're making publicly, because the risk in litigation, just the Delta case, talking about use of credits and otherwise, the litigation that our firm is handling in this space is tenfold what it was a year ago, and it's consumers and it's investors really looking, and it's all around disclosure. But Jeroen is really right. There is this ESG as a term started in 2004, and there was a lot of movement and corporate and investor action, and now there's regulation. But the regulation is almost all disclosure, and the compliance costs are really high, and I think we wait and see whether it's actually going to result in a positive impact on emissions, because we've already hit we've already hit the tipping point. So we've already hit 1.5 degrees. I don't know why everybody's still talking about going for it. I think we need to somehow stop it before a third of the Earth is uninhabitable.
We talk about limited overshoot. That's
yeah.
No, and I would add that there are implications, right? Because from an investment standpoint, if we look at companies that are at the forefront, right, of some of these climate technologies, and then they make certain claims about their technologies, which then regulators in different states take different views on, and then litigation results, and then it takes time, it takes expensive lawyers to actually help them, and for companies whose entire business models are predicated on there being a green premium because they are green, this can really impact their sort of existential sort of, it's existential for them. And as investors who actually invest into climate technologies, it's something that we have to grapple with all the time, right? So helping companies find that balance, right, between being at the forefront, but also knowing how to stay under the radar, knowing how to navigate a lot of this changing regulations, especially in the US, I think that's becoming increasingly critical. Yeah. And
there's going to be, regulation is shifting. So talking about, they didn't talk on the voluntary credit. There is a movement of having consistent standards for what constitutes a quality emission reduction that yields a credit. That's sort of the underlying. It's great that you turn them into commodities that trade and can create a secondary market, but underlying that needs to be fundamentally a project that results in emission reduction, or we're all kind of screwed, right? So, but regulation, I think, is always going to trail, and one of the interesting things for lawyers is then when regulations come and a company's already been operating, how we help them sort of manage between the two so it doesn't hold them back. And then there's just been a lot of, over the last 25 years, a lot of really creative lawyering, because again, investors and companies recognize that this is this is an existential risk for our survival, but it also impacts their business and their operations fundamentally. I mean, you know, it's when I run into people who run hedge, I got to debate the guys who are running the anti-ESG hedge funds in Florida for Berkeley a couple months ago, and it's like, you know, you're going to be underwater. You've got to assess your supply chain. You've got to make certain business decisions that are not, you know, yeah.
So Suze, you talked about creative lawyering, and we've talked a lot about investments, getting money where it needs to go. Right, we have a question from the audience that says, what are some examples of post-investment management that we have implemented, utilized to ensure that climate impact continues to be achieved? And Kim, you touched upon that earlier as well. So Peter and Kim, maybe a question to you on how we ensure that post-exit, because investment horizons are an actuality. So how do we ensure that climate impact is permanent or more permanent than your investment horizon?
You know, I always zero on our climate impact fund, of course, being here, and that's still in its investment phase. So, but you know, you always have an eye on exits, and this is an impact fund, and so we've established already protocols around what quality we want to see for an exit, and so. Part of that exit will be measuring the impact while we've been invested in that company. So, you know, how much positive impact is measurable. That data is we have confidence in, and that can potentially be used by the company. We have so much confidence in it when it's going to market. And so, and again, coming back to this team thing, you know, the sponsors, the company creators, are behind their product doing some good. We have invested in it for that reason, and so no one wants to see a competitor come in and buy the company and extinguish the technology, for example, in a competitive situation. So you know, we're going to be very proactive, or we intend to be very proactive when we're in the exit phase to make sure that that impact continues.
Right. I think two different ways of thinking about post-investment. One is while you're still in the business, while you're still an investor, and one is when, you know, you've actually exited the business. So, I mean, I'll cover what we do to make sure that post-exit, actually, things still continue to work the way we do. So a lot of what I talked about earlier in terms of permanence, right, also relates to how we think about exit, which is similar to what Peter mentioned. And there, I think putting in place mechanisms that will remain even post our exit, or even specifying that if a project developer that we're sort of working alongside for a particular project decides to sell, who can he sell to, and what does the seller, the buyer of, you know, of his stake, actually still need to actually be committed to. So actually thinking about some of these things, even at the point of putting the documentation in place, is critical, because you can't decide at that point when he wants to sell to say, whoa, you know, you can't be selling to this random who has no intention of carrying on with this project. And these are very real considerations, because, you know, these projects are long gestation. It could be the case that 10 years later, this conversation happens, and none of us who actually did the original investment are going to be around. So I think that's how it ties to the sort of post-exit kind of thing. And I think for us, ensuring that climate impact continues to be achieved needs to be driven by continual engagement with the portfolio companies from the get-go, from the point of due diligence, from the point when you have done your ESG sort of diligence and found these gaps and whatever. You really need to be setting in place a regular cadence of engagement, a regular sort of dashboard of information that you've already said at the outset you will need this company to give you, and then tracking against these very clear and concrete milestones. Are really critical. And I think the good thing is that investing in this space is that most of the businesses are aligned, right? Because we're all in it for the climate impact, right? So they're aligned with you, they're aligned with your fellow investors, right? And so usually we like to think that the intention and the spirit of doing this is something that we can actually, you know, work off as a good basis, right, for such engagements.
I'll take it to the US, and just in the US you do have it's interesting, and this underlines all the regulation in this space too, this sort of difference between single and double materiality. And in Asia and Europe, much more double materiality, the US, single materiality, and Revlon and its progeny in terms of if you get a buyer and they're paying the highest price, you got to go with them. What I mentioned, the new corporate forms, the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, is starting to be used as what's referred to as a sweet pill. So what it does is, for the underlying portfolio company, it gives the company and the board a right to say, no, I'm not selling to the company that's going to shut it down, even if they're paying the highest price. And that's something sort of, again, it's a new tool, and there are about 5 other tools that we've used through M&A that have worked when Unilever has purchased or other large acquirers, and it's worked fairly well.
Did you have something to add?
Yeah, sorry, I realized I didn't talk about the interaction with the company post-investment. So just from our perspective, you don't just establish the KPIs and everything's fine, you've got your reporting in line. Of course, we actively work with the companies, run workshops on impact for them. The board agrees that the board will have impact, GHG reduction strategies, etc., as part of their ongoing board cadence. Our impact team, as required and as our investment managers see as needed, work with the portfolio companies to the point of when I was talking to our head of impact a while ago, last week, he said that he's just been involved in a process appointing a head of sustainability for one of the portfolio companies. So it can get that granular, of course.
Kim, I hate to work, to make you work hard for your time here, but you were the only panelist that raised up your hand when I asked about corporates. So you've got a room full of largely legal practitioners. Any key points on, apart from lower fees, that you share with us of how we can support corporates in this space?
Yeah, lower fees would truly be very helpful. But in addition to that, I think, and I like what Susie mentioned around how lawyers are being very creative, right? Which is something actually we don't hear very often, right, about corporate lawyers. Sorry, But I think because what we're doing in climate, right, especially in nature, is extremely different. I think that creativity and the ability to draw on best practices from different types of sort of businesses, right? Like I mentioned, it's very infrastructure-like, it's very mining-like, but at the same time, it's a little bit different, right? So being able to take on all these features that you see in legal agreements from all over the place, meaning no templates, yeah, which is something that lawyers sometimes like to rely on, right? So saying that, like, look, this is something that's quite amorphous, it's quite different, and it's got a certain objective, and how do we bring best practices from different fields together to actually make it a sort of agreement that is first of a kind, so to speak, right? I think that is what I think lawyers can really help us with, right? And I think ultimately, for some of the earlier stage investments that we make, being also fairly reasonable about how we can try to put everything into the legal documents, but perhaps actually the companies don't even know, right? So being sort of flexible enough and reasonable enough in terms of the clauses that we have to not try to protect everything, I think that would be helpful.
So to wrap up this panel, and I'm conscious there were a lot of questions, so our panelists are all available after this to have further conversations. I wanted to summarize this in 3 points using the primary colors, RGB, and I know some might argue green is not a primary color, but it is a color for GenZero, so you have to forgive me. So R for the role of lawyers. We play a crucial role to accelerate decarbonization. G for greater action, because greater action is indeed needed for us to collaborate to achieve effective solutions for climate action. And B for balance. We recognize there is a need for balance between the risks that we may be exposed to, but also the need or recognition that doing the minimum may no longer be enough. And with that, I leave you to thank my panelists for this very exciting conversation. Thank you.